The country and Congress need assurances that the special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation will continue unimpeded. Unfortunately, legislation by Congress to protect Mr. Mueller is incompatible with the Constitution's separation of powers. Instead, there is another way, firmly grounded in the nation's history, to provide assurances to all Americans, both supporters and opponents of the investigation, that the rule of law will prevail. It comes out of a forgotten part of the story, which came in the wake of President Richard Nixon's so-called Saturday Night Massacre. President Trump and his Justice Department should follow the path of none other than Robert Bork. Let's begin with the problem. Prominent voices continue to urge President Trump to take various ill-considered steps, to pressure Attorney General Jeff Sessions to resign, making room for someone who can fire Mr. Mueller, to dismiss Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who has the power to fire Mr. Mueller but has so far refused to consider doing so, and otherwise to denounce the entire investigation. All of that predictably has led to bipartisan calls for legislation to protect Mr. Mueller's job. But the proposed legislation is imperfect. Putting aside the question of whether Congress could muster the political will to pass such legislation, in our view a legislative fix would probably be unconstitutional. The Constitution vests the President with the power over prosecutors, and it is hard to imagine courts permitting Congress to place serious restrictions on that power. Imagine if the shoe were on the other foot. The President shouldn't be able to place restrictions on whom Congress can hire or fire, or whom federal judges can hire as their law clerks. A similar principle generally applies to Congress. Yet there is a deep need to do something to protect the investigation. Here is where Bork paved the way. Recall what happened during Watergate. President Nixon ordered his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Instead, Richardson refused and resigned. Nixon then asked the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, to do it, but he, too, refused and resigned. Finally it fell to the Solicitor General, Bork, to carry out the order, which he did. Bork was harshly criticized for doing so, and we aren't interested in reopening that debate here. Instead, it is what Bork did afterward that is so important. As acting Attorney General, Bork appointed a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski. He then issued a regulation that the President will not exercise his constitutional powers to effect the discharge of the special prosecutor or to limit the independence that he is hereby given. It went on to specify that the special prosecutor could be terminated only for extraordinary improprieties, and even then, Nixon could do it only with the consensus of the House and Senate majority and minority leaders, and the chairman and ranking members of the chamber's judiciary committees. Bork codified these restrictions in federal regulations, and told the news media that Nixon had agreed to them. With doubts sown about Nixon's commitment to the rule of law, Bork devised a solution that brought the branches of government together. Rather than waiting for Congress to regulate the firing of prosecutors, he seized the initiative and invited Congress in from the start. His maneuver deftly sidestepped the most serious constitutional problems with legislation, because the executive branch voluntarily was bringing Congress into the picture. Unfortunately, the Bork regulations have lapsed. Both of us have been head of the Solicitor General's office, where Bork served. But more important, each of us has struggled with these problems for a long time. One of us, Mr. Starr, investigated President Bill Clinton under the Independent Counsel Act. The other, Mr. Cadhill, drafted the special counsel regulations in the Clinton administration that now govern the appointment of Mr. Mueller. We come at this from different sides of the aisle but share the conviction that President Trump's Justice Department should issue modern-day Bork regulations. In one swoop, President Trump could assure the public that he will let the investigation continue. He could reassure Congress, which might be tempted to regulate or investigate on its own, and dueling investigations can be counterproductive. A Bork regulation would also assure Mr. Mueller himself that he can carry out his job without the specter of interference. Moreover, it would reassure the Justice Department and Mr. Rosenstein, along with the career men and women of the Justice Department and the FBI, whom the President has unfairly impugned. Most important, it would be a sign of respect to Congress, showing it that the President wants to bring its members into the decision-making fold on this most sensitive of questions. And if the President doesn't permit a Bork regulation, that silence will speak volumes. If President Trump cannot agree to an investigation modeled on what Richard Nixon agreed to, the question will linger: just what is he afraid of?